Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Superior Health Quality Alliance Roundtable conversation. My name's Kim Heft. I'm joined by my colleagues, Janae and Yvonne, as well as our guest speaker today, Mia Croyle. For those of you that have been joining these meetings over the past few weeks, or even maybe the past year, welcome back. If you're new to the call, we're really glad that you're here. We host this 1 hour session on the second and fourth Wednesday of the month. Now, the first half of the presentation is a didactic presentation, and then the remaining time will be for Q&A. Besides learning from our speakers, I want to thank you, our participants, for helping your fellow nursing home leaders on this call. In the past, you've shared resources and strategies, and we appreciate you and we encourage you to continue supporting each other. If there's something on your mind though, or something that's given you a struggle and you're trying to figure things out, you can send me a direct message in the Zoom chat, or you can put your suggestions in our survey at the end of the session for possible topics for future presentations. Now you're going to see the link for the PowerPoint presentation in chat momentarily. We'll be getting to that. And please use the chat box to share any comments, questions, anything that pops into your mind during the presentation. And then we're going to use that for discussion in our Q&A. But before we get started with our presentation, I'd like to briefly talk just a little bit about short stay residents who are rehospitalized after a nursing home admission, and then were readmitted to the hospital within 30 days. We would like to know what conditions residents are being readmitted with, which in turn can help us here at Superior Health better serve you and the communities we serve. So I'm going to launch this polling question right here. All right. And on this polling question, what I'd like to know is most of your facility readmissions are due to what? You can pick more than one, but if you could just maybe pick the top two, that would really help us have a better understanding of what kind of, again, conditions, things that you're seeing for readmissions to your facility. If there's something though that's not on here and you would really like to point out and it's not listed, put that in chat for me, please. Okay, so we're getting our participants here are putting in their answers right now. Okay. All righty. Well, I'll tell you, it looks like we have a lot of sepsis and complications of chronic conditions such as CHF, maybe end-stage renal disease, could be diabetes. Yes, and falls and other injuries. All right. Okay, I'll share these results here with you too real quick just to see how you compare to each other. All right, thank you for that. And you actually might be hearing a lot more from Superior Health in regards to helping in the reduction of 30-day hospital readmissions. So more to come on that. All right. Okay, so today though, Mia Croyle, she's our speaker, and she is an experienced practitioner and trainer of motivational interviewing. She's a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers since 2011. Now, today's presentation is partnering with families using motivational interviewing. So we're going to learn how to talk to our families using this great technique. So welcome, Mia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. And like Kim said, I am pleased to spend some time today talking with you about ways that we could utilize some of what we know from motivational interviewing to help us form better partnerships with families, other caregivers, other, interested parties who might want to connect with us, but have some ideas about what that might look like in terms of the care for your residents and their loved one. So just looking at a couple objectives for today. Hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll be familiar with change talk and sustain talk and what those are and why we care about them. And we're going to look specifically at a few of our motivational interviewing skills. So we hope that you could describe the use of open questions in this context, and then also recognize and maybe start to preliminarily have some comfort using our skill of reflective listening as a skill that can really support connection and engagement. If there are other things that you would really like me to answer, questions you'd like to get answered, or things you'd like me to go over about motivational interviewing, feel free to put them in the chat at any point. I'll look to my colleagues at Superior Health to read out it. Let me know if there's stuff in the chat that feels relevant. Otherwise, we will take, we have some time built in at the end for questions. But if there's something that feels like maybe it would be relevant at the time, you put it in when you think of it, so you don't lose that thought, and we'll worry about when it makes the most sense to break in and add that to discussion. So just to sort of level set a little bit, motivational interviewing is an evidence-based practice, but I just want to be clear that, due to our limited length and our format, this talk really is not enough to fully prepare you to deliver this with any fidelity to the evidence base. So we know from a lot of research on how people learn motivational interviewing best that it is a developmental process, and it requires an investment in time and effort over the long term. So today can certainly be a step in your journey toward learning motivational interviewing, but it probably is not the end point if you are really wanting to get super skillful at this evidence-based practice. Just a very little bit of background in case this is your first exposure to motivational interviewing. This is a communication style, and it originally was developed in the context of alcohol treatment, alcohol and drug treatment, because those are often hand in hand. And that was over 30 years ago that the first sort of research studies on this were published. And what I can say is that it's still used very frequently in that context. It's still certainly a thing in that context, but very shortly after the initial studies were released, people started looking at it in the broader healthcare context. So, diet and exercise, medication adherence, all sorts of things have been studied, and there really is a very robust evidence base. When you get these slides, these are hyperlinked, so you could go right to the list of publications. And there's been over 1,200 articles published on motivational interviewing and over 200 randomized control trials looking at sort of motivational interviewing up against the usual care. So I want to share with you a few key concepts that I think can be very useful when we think about talking to people and in particular, talking to people about change. Now, when we think about the context of connecting with our families, sometimes there isn't necessarily a clear-cut identified change, and sometimes there is. So motivational interviewing in its preliminary stages is really very, very focused on engagement. And as you progress with your motivational interviewing, it becomes a little more focused on change. So we can certainly use that engagement piece in all our interactions. And then we can think about the pieces that are a little more focused on change as we progress in the conversation. So one of the key concepts in motivational interviewing is ambivalence. And that's really just the description of feeling both ways about something. If you think about any change in your own life, you know, anything that you sort of have on your to-do list or your New Year's resolution list, you probably could come up with some arguments for making that change and some arguments against it. I like to use the example of the McDonald's drive-through. We live in a smallish town, and McDonald's is sort of our main fast food option. And my kids just love McDonald's. And I'm not a huge fan of McDonald's and the nutrition it offers or doesn't, and the cost, right? So every so often I sort of make a resolution with myself that we're just not going to do the McDonald's drive-through. And I can list all the reasons, right? It's money we don't need to be spending. We have food at home. It's not very healthy. It's greasy. I don't particularly like it. So it's not, you know, a meal we can get for the whole family. All of that. And on the other side of that ambivalence is it's quick and easy. If we're running and running and running, which we often are, it's a way to just get some food in the kids quickly. Also, you know, it makes the kids kind of happy. So if they're, you know, in grumbly moods and I say, hey, you want to go get French fries? That's a mood changer for them. Or let's go get ice cream cones at McDonald's. And it, you know, there's sort of the other side of it is if they're begging for McDonald's and we go home and I cook a meal and serve it to them, they're still going to be unhappy and not really eat much of the meal. So it's a lot of effort for not much reward. So, you know, there's argument, and then there's just inertia, right? It's easy to do it's easy to keep doing whatever you've been doing. So that is both sides of my ambivalence. What we call anything that are my own arguments for making the change, we call that in motivational interviewing change talk, right? So it's not anybody else's ideas about why I should make the change. It's my own ideas about why that change matters to me. And we know that helping people identify and give voice to their change talk is a very strong predictor of change. So the more we can focus our efforts on how do we help people talk about those arguments for change, we know that's setting them up to be more successful. And then the flip side of that ambivalence is sustained talk. So those are the arguments against making a change. You know, it's easy, it's fast, it keeps my kids happy. You know, those are my sustained talk things. I don't have to think about putting a meal together. All those things are my sustained talk. So those are the flip side, both sides of that ambivalence. And we know that when we help people talk about their sustained talk more, that is a strong predictor of not changing. So just like with change talk, we can sort of help someone talk themselves into making a change. If we focus too much on their sustain talk, we can help people talk themselves out of making a change. And we're going to go through a live example, and I think it might become a little more clear as we work through an example of what those are. The other key concept in motivational interviewing that I really want to highlight is empathy. And this really plays a role in our connection with the other person. So we rely on empathy a lot in motivational interviewing, and empathy doesn't mean sympathy. It doesn't mean that we've had the same experience. It doesn't mean we feel sorry for them. It just means that we're actively trying to understand their point of view and their perspective. And often that's very different from our own. And that's where I think in healthcare, it makes motivational interviewing challenging, because our point of view is informed by a lot of things. We have knowledge that we worked really hard and went to school, and we have hard-won knowledge, so to speak, about how the body works, about disease processes that our family members probably don't have. We also have experience. We've seen similar situations play out before. So from our point of view, it's, the path is clear. And often and so we place a high value on that. We place a high value on sort of medical scientific knowledge and our experience. Now, the family members may or may not place those same values on medical knowledge, on science, on our experience, right? They're going based on the things that they value, which might be, their much more limited experience. They had a different family member who had a similar experience, and they're relying on what happened there, as opposed to, we've seen 20 or 30 of these cases play out, hundreds even maybe. So with motivational interviewing, with our empathy, what it asks us to do is to just set aside our own point of view, not because it's wrong, but just because what we want to do in order to establish a good connection and a good partnership with the other person is understand their point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to accept that their point of view is the truth, but just to understand it. We want to know, where are they coming from? What values are they relying on, or what experiences are they relying on to make decisions as they move forward through it? And so we use this idea of empathy a lot in motivational interviewing. The other important thing that I want to share with you when we're talking about change is this idea of psychological reactance. Now, that sounds very like academic and jargony, but really what it means is people don't like to be told what to do. And generally, when we tell people what to do, their impulse is to push back. So even though we're telling them what to do with every best intention, they interpret that as a potential loss of their own autonomy, so their own control. And our systems perceive that as a threat. And we know what happens to our systems when they perceive a threat. To some degree, we go into fight, flight, or freeze, right? That's our response to a perception of a threat. And so if we think about, if a family feels like we're trying to push them into something that they're not comfortable with or they don't want to do, they're going to respond in some of those ways. And so one of the things we do with motivational interviewing is we try really hard not to trigger that threat response. And the other thing that we do is we pay attention, and when it appears that that threat response may have been triggered, we respond with empathy. We lean into it. Sometimes we might apologize. Gosh, it seems like you're feeling like I'm trying to take your choice away right here. I just want to apologize because that's not my intention at all. And I didn't mean to give you that impression. What I'm trying to do is X, Y, or Z, give you some information so you can make the choice, or, whatever we were trying to accomplish in that degree. So just sort of knowing about this feature can help us sidestep it in some degree and safely sort of navigate our way through it without totally disrupting the relationship in the meantime. I'm going to pause here for just a second. Any questions about what's been presented so far? Anything you want to hear a little more about? Otherwise, we're going to move on.
Right now, there's nothing in the chat, Mia.
Okay, thank you. And again, just a reminder, if you think of things as you think of them, feel free to pop them in the chat. So there's several different components. If we were launching into a full learning of motivational interviewing, this is sort of the map of what you'd have to learn about. So we talk about the spirit of motivational interviewing, and that is just our general approach, that it really relies on partnership, compassion. Evocation means we're really trying to draw things out from the other person. And acceptance, that sort of unconditionally accepting the person, even if they're not making the choice that we might be making, et cetera. And then also accepting that they are the ones who are in control, and accepting that they have autonomy and they're making choices. It's a little different when we're talking about family members because they're making choices for someone else as opposed to choices for themselves, but really sort of recognizing and acknowledging that and accepting that choice is in their hands and not ours. And then we talk about the 4 processes, and these are sort of the steps that we go through as we work on sort of progressing through the stages of motivational interviewing. So we start with engaging, and that's where I talked about, we really rely heavily on listening and empathy. And then focusing is where we mutually decide on an area of focus or a change. And then evoking is where we start to really hone in on that change talk. And we work hard to sort of draw that out. How do we pull out the change talk? We create opportunities for them to give voice to it. And then our last step in that process of change is planning. So we may only in any given encounter be focusing in engaging. We may have already have a strong engagement with the family member. And so we may be able to jump pretty quickly to focusing or evoking. It's just going to depend on the circumstances and the other person. And then this is the part, if you've heard about motivational interviewing before or done any learning, this is probably the part you're most familiar with, which is our strategies and our skills. So ORS, and that stands for the open questions, reflections, affirmations, and summary. And then another skill that's added on there is that a listening talk. So this is sort of a map of the universe, motivational interviewing, and we are going to zero in on a few things here. And, I've been talking at you for a long time, and sort of it's like, I think we get in this spot where it's like, well, this is all nice in theory, but what does it actually look like?
think we may have lost her.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think she's completely off now.
Yeah, I think we did just lose Mia. Okay, well, let's give her a second to pop back on.
I'm back. I don't know what happened. All of a sudden,
there
it just
she
kicked
is.
me out.
Well, you did, Mia, you did freeze there for a second, so
Okay.
then you just like lost. I maybe if I notice that happening again, I may just call you out and tell you to turn off your camera
Okay.
just in case. That might help.
Perfect. Yeah. It's interesting. My internet never showed that it got disconnected and it's at like full bars, but
Okay.
the ways of the electronics are mysterious to me. So do you have a sense of where it cut off? Where I
You were just going to be going to your next slide. Now, of course, we don't
Okay.
see your presentation
Okay.
right now, so you'll have to reshare.
Got it. And what I was saying was, we've talked in theory about these skills and about motivational interviewing for a while now. And what I'd like to do, what we thought would be helpful at this point, is to give you a live demo. So if my demo partner is ready, we can start. Any questions before we do the demo?
Now,
Okay.
are we doing the emergency department transfer first, Mia?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Right. So that's Yvonne. Oh, this is Mrs. Jones. Very nice. Very nice,
Yes.
Mrs. Jones. Glad you could join us today.
Thank you.
So we have Mrs. Jones and myself, and I am going to be calling Mrs. Jones because her mother at my facility has had a change in condition. So you can listen. As you listen, I invite you to pay attention to, what do you hear in terms of empathy? Where does it seem like I'm trying to understand her perspective and her point of view and giving her opportunities to explain her point of view to me? And then also, what do you hear in terms of her ideas about making the change, which would be doing what we're recommending, would be the change that we're talking about, versus not making the change, and that would be going with her other idea. All right. So questions about that before we start? All right. Ring, ring.
Hello.
Hi, Mrs. Jones. This is Kim from Sunnydale Nursing Home. I'm your mom's nurse, and I wanted to let you know she's had a change in condition. She's been restless this evening, pacing the halls and frequently getting out of bed. I think she's trying to find the bathroom. She seems to be having some issues with urinary urgency and frequency, and she might also be having some flank pain. She's putting her hands on her lower back, and I don't usually see her do this. She's also had an elevated temp of 105, and I think she might have a urinary tract infection. I called her doctor, and we're going to get a urine sample and start her on an antibiotic.
I want her to be evaluated at the emergency room. I just don't think that nursing homes are well enough equipped to take care of my mother in emergency situations. And this sounds like an emergency.
Yeah, you're worried about this change in her condition.
Darn right I am. At her previous nursing home, they always sent my mother to the emergency room when she got like this. I don't want her to get so sick that she ends up with sepsis. That's what happened to her at that last nursing home.
Mrs. Jones, you don't want her to get very sick again. I hear that.
I sure don't. No, I don't. That's why you have to send her to the emergency room before she gets any worse.
Yeah, I think we might have a somewhat different approach to managing your mother's symptoms than at her previous nursing home. And I'm wondering, would it be okay if I share with you just a little bit about our approach in general?
Okay, I guess.
Well, we find that it's really disruptive to our residents with dementia like your mom to send them to the ER for symptoms of what appears to be a urinary tract infection. We follow evidence-based standards of care when a resident develops undesirable symptoms. We do a full assessment of the resident, including
Sorry, that's vital signs.
Sorry. We do a full assessment of the resident, including vital signs, and report to the physician the resident's current situation. We report the background or history, and then we discuss with the physician the best interventions for the resident based on all the information we presently have. We try to use those interventions before we think about a transfer to the ED. We just want to keep her safe and at home with us, if at all possible. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. All of that sounds good. But I'm so worried she's going to get really sick, and this isn't going to work in the long run. I just feel like she will need to visit the ER at some point, don't you?
Well, you may very well be right. And I assure you that if it seems like we're unable to keep her safe, we won't hesitate to send her to the ER. I also want to let you know her physician is scheduled to come by tomorrow. So if she needs further tests or treatment, we can address that at that time. And I'll also call you with the results of the urine culture once I have them. And if your mom has any further changes in her condition, we'll notify you and her doctor. Are you okay with this plan?
Okay, I'm okay.
All right. Okay. So I would love to hear general reactions to that. How do you think that went? What stood out to you? And you can come off mute and just give us your feedback, your comments and thoughts verbally, or you can put them in the chat.
Well, it sounds like you indicated to her that she was right about the things and the feelings that she had. So you validated her feelings, but you also restated to her what her concerns were.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a big point of the interaction was making sure that she felt heard and making sure that, you know, we convey to her that we understand her level of concern. We understand sort of what her priorities are in this situation, and then helping her see how, you know, our approach aligns with those as opposed to is something different from those. But yeah, the you know, one of the things that we really heavily lean into in motivational interviewing is that people just want to be heard. They want to be understood. And if we can give them that, often then they're much more willing to sort of come up alongside us and go along with, you know, the rest of it once they know that we've heard them. Other things that stood out for you. There may be things that you're like, oh, that's exactly what we do. You can share those with us too.
Mia, this is Wanda, and I was interested in how at each step of the way you also allowed her to be in control of the outcome. So essentially asking for permission at sort of each step of the way to make sure that she certainly was comfortable and was heard, but also had in some ways control of the situation. So that
Yeah.
respect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the crucial points where I did that is where I I asked permission to explain about our approach, because that can sound a little bit, if we don't have their permission, it can sound a little preachy. It can sound like, well, we're better than you. We know better than you. And here's why, as opposed to, getting her permission. It feels like such a small thing to just ask, is it okay if I share with you this information? But in my experience, it kind of is very transformative often in the conversation, because all of a sudden they're bought in, like they're at least giving you, and a lot of times you'll get sort of a grudging, okay, yeah, okay, fine. But then they're on board and they'll at least listen, as opposed to, if you don't ask permission, it just has a much different feel to it. If we just launch into, well, here's all the reasons why we use this approach. Your other nursing home was probably doing it wrong, The other thing is that, making sure that we validate those feelings, just always validating, you're concerned, you're worried, you don't want this, you want this. And we can do that without, I lost my train of thought. We can do that without agreeing that it's right, but it's their truth. So validating that and just showing them that you hear that. It is, like you said, it's a little just more respectful. One of the things that people get a little worried about with asking permission sometimes is like, oh, well, what do I do if they say no? And so we do want to make sure that we only ask permission for the things that we could respect a no for. If there's something that has to happen, for example, if you needed to make a call to report something, a violation or an abuse situation, like that's not something the family can say yes or no to. So I wouldn't ask their permission. I might tell them and then emphasize their control, their ability to be in control and have choices in other ways. So this is what I'm required to do. There are some choices on your end in terms of how you respond to that. You could do this, you could do this, or you could do this. So that kind of thing. All right, well, I think in the interest of time, I'll keep us moving forward. We have another demo at the end that we're planning to do. So if that felt helpful, there's more to come. If it didn't feel helpful, sorry, there's one more coming, but we're gonna look first at a little bit more of our skills. We're just gonna do a little bit of a deeper dive into open questions and reflections. So when we think about our open questions, we want to approach them with this idea and this mindset of compassionate curiosity. We're not trying to catch them being wrong or being inconsistent or anything like that with our questions. We just are using them as a tool to better understand them and the situation. So an open question is a question that can't be answered with just a yes or a no or a one-word response. And we want to, when we're building an open question, we want to generally start it with either how or what. Technically, why is also an open question, but we advise to avoid that if possible, because it can be perceived as a little bit judgmental if you're asking someone why. I like this list. This is sort of my list of all-purpose open questions. Like if I don't really know what else I should be asking, these can often get us some momentum. So we could ask for an example. We could ask them to tell us, what was that like? How would you like things to be different? What do you want to do next? Or then this last one is my very favorite open question. It's my back pocket. It's the one I have always, always in my back pocket. Tell me more. So tell me more about. Now, I know that technically that's a statement and not a question, but in motivational interviewing, we allow it to count as an open question. When we hear themes of change talk, when we start to hear their arguments for the change, we want to get extra curious and ask more. So we want to ask for details or examples when we start to hear about that change talk. We could have, asked in what ways, tell me more. What does it look like? When's the last time it happened? Give me an example. What else? And then sometimes we find that change talk doesn't just naturally occur. And so if we want to draw it out, if we want to create an opportunity for them to talk about it, we could ask, how were things better or different before? Moving forward, how would you like things to be? We can ask, what's the worst thing that might happen if you don't make the change? What's the best thing that might happen if you do make the change? And the bottom line is, open questions are they're not sort of rocket science. It's not too hard to figure out if a question is open or closed. We tend to think that we're asking a lot more open questions than we actually are. I've learned this from a lot of recorded samples where I'm coaching people. And I hear, I ask them usually estimate how many of your questions were open, and their estimation is usually quite a bit higher than the actual number. The other sort of take home about open questions is not that open questions are good and closed questions are bad. They both play a role. If we were looking at proficiency targets, we would want to see at least half of your questions to be open. So it's just about being a little more intentional with the questions that we ask and when we ask what type of question. The second MI skill that I just want to do a quick little review of before we get to our second demo is reflective listening. So sometimes this is similar to a skill called active listening. There are some differences, but reflective listening is a statement and it's intended to mirror what was said or meant. This is one of the main ways that we show our empathy, and you get to choose what to reflect, and that can help determine what direction you go in. So in order to build a reflection, we start with you often or it's. We want to avoid overusing those introductory phrases like it sounds like or what I think I hear you saying, because those feel a little gimmicky and they just get us in this mindset of I'm doing something here as opposed to just a conversation. So a couple examples. There's two types of reflections, simple and complex, and it really just talks about where our focus is. So I said with our reflections, we want to reflect either what was said or what was meant. So with our iceberg, if the water line is sort of what was said and everything above that water line is the words that the other person used, our simple reflections work on reflecting that. So we might repeat part or all of what they said or give a slight rephrasing. And so here is an example. I'm really concerned about this plan. I don't want mom on a medication she doesn't need. And I agree the side effects aren't great, but she was put on that medication because she was having all these episodes. And I don't want to go back to that because it was so hard on her and us. So there's a lot there, and a simple reflection could be something like you're concerned. You don't want her on meds she doesn't need. right? So you're picking out pieces of it to reflect. And in this instance, that you don't want her on meds she doesn't need would be the change talk, because the discussion is reducing use of an antipsychotic medication. Now, if we want to look at our more complex reflections, we are looking at what we think is under the waterline. So we can make an educated, reasonable guess. And our reflection is our way of checking that out. So we want the other person to respond to that reflection in some way. They might verify that we're accurate. They might add on to that. They might slightly adjust it, or they might correct us altogether. And all of those are valid responses to reflective listening, and all of those are desired responses. So it's not like you have to get it 100% right all the time. So ways that we can get more complexity, we can reflect unspoken emotion. We could do a double-sided reflection, which means we're reflecting back both sides of their ambivalence. We could continue the paragraph. So if they hadn't stopped talking, what might they have said next? Or we could reflect by offering a metaphor. And those are a little hard. If they don't occur to you, then you don't have one. There's no way to sort of force a metaphor. But using that same statement as an example, let's just look at what that would look like. I'm really concerned about this plan. I don't want mom on a medication she doesn't really need. And I agree the side effects aren't great, but she was put on that medication because she was having all these episodes. And I don't want to go back to that because it was so hard on her and us. So unspoken emotion might look like you're worried. If we wanted to reflect a double-sided, so both sides of that ambivalence, on one hand, you don't want her behavior to backslide. And on the other hand, you don't want her on unnecessary meds with worrisome side effects. Okay. Continuing the paragraph, if they hadn't stopped talking, we're just going to make a guess about what might have come next. So in this case, the guess is, and you're hoping to leave here with a better plan. And then a metaphor is you feel stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Like you have two bad choices that you're not thrilled about either of them. So those are some examples of types of reflections. In the real world, you don't need to know if it's a simple reflection or a complex reflection. I will tell you, if all that you do is simple reflections, people will pick up on it pretty quickly and it gets a little annoying. I call those the parrot reflections because you're just kind of parroting back what people said. So pretty quickly you need to work in some guesses about that underlying meaning if you're going to use a lot of reflections, which the evidence shows that reflective listening is a very powerful skill in motivational interviewing. And we like to see a ratio of 2 reflective listening statements for every 1 question. That's sort of the fidelity marker for that. All right, so that was sort of like a crash course in open questions and reflective listening. We have another demo. Before we jump into that, any questions you need, anything you need clarified before we hop into our demo number 2? Now, demo number 2 is going to be a little different. We're going to do a little bit of a demo, and then we are going, and it's a focus on immunizations, but then we're going to call time out and ask you guys as a group, what do you think we should do next? So Janae, are you ready?
Yep.
All right. So Janae and I are going to have a conversation about Janae's father's immunization status. Hi, Janae.
Hi, Mia. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Thanks for stopping in today. I know you were here to visit your dad, and I just wanted to grab a minute to talk with you. So I'm wondering if we can take a few minutes to talk about your dad's immunizations. I noticed that there's several immunizations he hasn't gotten this year, including COVID and the flu shot.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't like the idea of putting even more medications in his body, and I don't think he would want that either.
It doesn't feel like the right thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I understand why you want him to receive the vaccines. I'm just not sure about them.
Tell me a little bit about your understanding of why we're recommending this for your dad.
Well, I figure it'd probably be pretty bad if he got the flu or COVID. I know his lungs aren't very strong anymore.
Okay, so we're calling time out. What do you think we should do next? Should we offer some advice and recommendations? Should we ask an open question? Or should we offer a reflective listening statement? And I don't see all your faces because I'm sharing my screen. So feel free to chime in here or in the chat. Again, the choices are advice and recommendations, open question, reflective listening.
Okay, so we have advice. We're going for advice.
All right. So, all right. So, Janae, we do really recommend that all of our residents get the vaccines. Given your father's age, and as you already mentioned, he does have issues with his lungs and his breathing already. We just really don't want him to get sick. We work really hard to try and keep him healthy, and getting the vaccines has to be a part of that.
I appreciate your advice, but I mean, I don't really think he would end up being placed on a ventilator or anything like that, do you?
So you're thinking, that would sort of be worst case scenario, and you're not sure that kind of level of severity would apply to your dad.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think I hear a little bit of a question in there. Is that something you want me to try and answer?
Sure.
Well, honestly, we can't ever really know what would happen if someone got sick. But what we do know is that there are identified risk factors, and your dad has a lot of them. So do I know for sure that he would end up on a ventilator? Absolutely not. He could be one of those people who has a mild case. What we know is that the vaccine helps, even if people do get COVID, helps them have a more mild case of it, which would be our best outcome if he were to get COVID. And it helps them prevent getting it altogether. Given, the fact that he's already on some supplemental oxygen, I think we want to make sure that we protect his lungs with, as much as we have in our sort of tool belt to do that.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So it sounds like your response is shifting a little bit. Are there other things you want to talk through?
I think that was my biggest concern. Is the vaccine something that he'd be able to get here at the facility?
Yes, we do. We have some vaccine clinics, so I can get you the information for that, and we can go from there.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, observations. things you noticed.
I did like how you suddenly kind of asked her for permission to go further. It wasn't literally that same sentence of can I tell you more about whatever? I don't remember exactly what you said, but you said it in such finesse that it was like just welcoming where she didn't feel threatened.
Yeah, and I often like I think what I said, and I don't was, I think I hear a question there. Is that something you'd like me to try and answer?
Yeah.
And that's the case a lot of the time. We assume that there's a question. And so I think a lot of what we do with our reflective listening is just checking out those assumptions before we go barreling forward, right? Like, I heard somebody ask me for information. I'm going to go galloping on with this information, particularly when the answer might be somewhat contradictory to what she's already said. So I don't want to just say, you're wrong, here's the right answer. It's like, here's my point of view on it. I've heard yours. I show you that I've heard yours by reflecting. And now I ask your permission to share mine. All right, well, we just have a few minutes left, so I wanted to leave room for any additional questions you might have, anything you might want to get answered here. And in the chat, I know you'll see that the link to the survey for your feedback on today is there. If you have any suggestions, any things you would like to see addressed, feel free to put them in. If there's more particular situations or things regarding motivational interviewing, I can certainly come back and show you different things or talk about different areas. So let us know that as well. Kim, I don't know if you have any other closing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this presentation, Mia. You can never get enough practice doing motivational interviewing, and the demonstrations are really hit home. So I really appreciate that. So I just wanted to tell everyone that our next session is April 26th. We are going to have Sally Pung. She's from the Michigan Ombudsman, and she is going to be talking about abuse prevention. So I hope to see all of you there. And if you can, please take a second to fill out the survey. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you again, Mia. And thank you, Yvonne or Mrs. Jones and Janae for being our role-playing participants. Again, everyone, have a great afternoon. Bye-bye now.